sign in order to know where you were. The plaque indicated, as if in ironic commentary, Place Saint Projet. You headed in the direction of the Saint Andre Cathedral. The size of this Gothic building impressed you. You went inside, but the darkness and the cold immediately put you off. Aside from some foreign tourists following a guide, the church was solely occupied by old ladies who were praying, seated, or kneeling. The paintings referred to by a laminated sign at the entrance were hardly visible, so bad was the failing light. You went back out and, after having walked alongside the city hall, walked in the direction of the Musée des Beaux-Arts. Workers were restoring the building and sanding the large stones of the facade. You made your way through the floor of dust, and the wind was blowing onto the main door and the bordering lawn. Inside, the two caretakers and the cashier were the only human presence. You perused the halls, where there was a succession of old paintings in the Italian, French, English, Flemish, and German schools. You looked at them distractedly, despite the quality of some of their works. You had the impression of having seen this museum dozens of times in other cities. Religions and mythological painting would take you back to a past where there was known and without surprises that was known. In provincial museums, used to look for the most unusual paintings of little-known local masters, the originality of which derived from their minor subjects or clumsy workmanship. This kind of originality was in short supply here unless it was in the form of a monumental panorama of the Garonne quays. The image showed commercial and maritime activities stretched out for kilometers with innumerable details. Dozens of characters, small relative to the represented space, brought scenes to life representing the entire social spectrum. The town, idealized by a warm glow, appeared to you in an entirely different light. Perhaps you needed the meditation of an image to appreciate the urban landscape. You stayed for an hour in order to itemize the scenes in the image, to scrutinize its works of architecture, to submerge yourself in this film painted 200 years ago, a film whose scenario you could, in your own way, have recomposed today. A few footsteps behind you brought you out of your reverie. A bored caretaker was watching you from a distance. You finished your visit in a minute. Your immersion in the panorama had prevented you from paying attention to the 18th century portraits around you, despite their merit. You didn't even linger in front of the one by John Hunter by Thomas Lawrence. Your footsteps echoed in the vast gallery through which no other visitor paced. You left the museum under a cloud of white dust and stared at the straight, bourgeois, elegant streets of a residential neighborhood. You looked around, furtively discovering interiors you would not see again. Along the sidewalk, the terraces of restaurants received office workers in suits, tourists, retirees. You were hungry, but you didn't want to eat alone in a restaurant. You preferred to buy a sandwich at a bakery and to eat it on a corner in front of a public square, watching the procession of passers-by. A girl came up to you to ask for a cigarette. You gave her two. She looked at you, surprised, and exaggeratedly thanked you. On your map, you looked for the coordinates of a photograph gallery that Damon had suggested to you. It was situated on the other side of town. Judging by the distance, it would have taken you more than an hour to get there. You passed back through the old town, relaxed. Having a goal to your walk was soothing to you. You walked along the Garonne. The quay was closed for construction. They were building a tramway. The construction works disfigured the road and the pavement. You had to skirt around fences, cross piles of sand, and avoid holes dug out of the sidewalk. The fronts of old dilapidated warehouses were being renovated one by one as the construction advanced. You paid more attention to the part of town undergoing mutation than to those parts fixed in old and beautiful neighborhoods. There you imagined the life to come. The cityscape existed less for what it was than what it would be soon. Between the town, as it was present, which you had crossed, or the town of the future your mind constructed on what your eyes gave it to see, you preferred the town of the past, which the panorama in the museum had showed to you. The photograph gallery was located near the port, amid industrial warehouses surrounding shipping containers and other materials. You walked alongside several sheds, ending up entering into a large gray and white space lit by bay windows situated high up. The exhibition, New Urban Zones, presented the work of 10 photographers who had surveyed the territories of Europe. Few clues permitted one to say where these views had been captured. The landscape portraits showed anonymous places, industrial or commercial zones in the suburbs of modern towns, often on the borderlines between urban and rural areas. There were no people to be seen. The only human presence hinted at was in the cars on the roads. The color prints in large formats were lined up as anonymously as the places they represented. It was difficult to distinguish one photograph from another. The framing was frontal, the colors flat, the prints carefully executed. You couldn't succeed in desiring these non-places offered to your view. The photographers had wanted neither to magnify nor to dramatize their subjects. The neutrality of their style recalled those of the buildings they had photographed. Life seemed to have escaped them. You thought the photographers were correct. Who could have wanted to live in those thankless, immense, and deserted places? Leaving the gallery again, you found that the port zone could easily have figured among them. But the wind, the bustle of life, the movement of people and vehicles that animated it, made the zone habitable. Was this a case of photography killing life by freezing it? It was 6 in the evening. Museums, galleries, and monuments were closing. You found yourself alone in the town without anything else to do but walk the streets and look at the shops, restaurants, architecture. You took the same road back you had come by in order to look at the urban landscape from an inverse point of view. You counted the buildings that you did not remember seeing earlier. There were dozens. You no longer believed in the hypothesis that everything is recorded in memory, but that we are only capable of recalling some of it according to memory's caprices. Between the next 2 roads, 9 buildings appeared. Only 3 of them were familiar to you. Each possessed one remarkable detail, the front door of one of them was adorned with a lion's head painted in blue. A totalizator for gambling on horse racing was installed on the ground floor of another, and the windows of the last, recently restored, were still covered in a green plastic film. Only 2 of the other buildings had distinctive marks. On one, a golden plaque stated, Charles Dreyfus, psychoanalyst, and the other contained a store selling scuba gear. In the display window of which 2 divers dressed in yellow and black, equipped with masks and fins, were floating in the middle of a subaquatic universe consisting of regulator valves, spear guns, electric torches, watches, snorkels, buoys, knives, and weights. You asked yourself how, on the one hand, the inscription which announced to passerby a room where confidences were shared, or on the other, this gleaming and comical window, could have escaped your attention. Had you been looking at the other side of the street, in the direction of the Garonne, what had you seen? Had you been lost in thought, or in the emptiness of the walk? You looked for explanations, rather than believed in the shortcomings of your memory. Following your itinerary in reverse, however, confirmed to you that there were now only remaining scraps of what you had seen earlier, heading in the other direction. You continued on by the scenery, the majority of whose detail were unknown to you. Having come close to the big theater, you considered turning back in order to verify whether, on a third passing, your memory would be more reliable, but you were hungry. You entered a restaurant decorated with antique woodwork and tables with marble tops. Some elderly regulars were drinking aperitifs while waiters were spreading tablecloths for the meal. Will you be dining with us? A waiter asked at the moment you told yourself that the place was too sad to spend an evening in alone. You told him that you were looking for someone, and after scanning the room you left. You wandered about for an hour for a modern restaurant. Night had fallen when you discovered, in a pedestrian cul-de-sac, a chic wine bar, softly lit, where they served tapas. The place was welcoming. 30-odd young people were chatting at the bar while slow electronic music created a relaxed atmosphere. Some low tables were occupied by groups of friends. You took up place in the corner on the windowed terrace in order to be able to observe the patrons of the bar at the same time as the people on the street. But the cul-de-sac was empty, and the only people circulating there were those coming to the bar or leaving it. You ordered squid, ham, chili peppers, chorizo sausage, and cured pork loin with a half bottle of Rioja. You had already eaten half your meal when the Polish artist with whom you had passed the previous evening came in looking for some friends. She did not see you and headed in their direction. You hesitated to interrupt her. You did not want to meet people, new people, you would not see again after leaving this city. But not to show yourself when you were alone seemed to you absurd, especially since you could not keep from looking at her. She turned toward you, recognized you, and gave you a big smile. You in turn smiled at her, embarrassed to think she might have believed you had wanted to shrug her off. Given your position, you couldn't help but have seen her. You both hesitated to make the first move toward the other. You looked at each other for what seemed to you an endless amount of time. You got up at last and made to join her. The introductions done with, you suggested she join you at the table, without including her friends. She accepted, despite the impoliteness of your proposal. You asked her questions about her life in Poland, about her family, and her art. She replied at length and with precision, but when she in turn asked questions of you, you responded with more questions. You had no desire to talk about yourself, but you could have listened to her talk about herself for hours. You wondered if you were trying to seduce her, and whether this had occurred to her. What would you do if her friends left without her, and if she walked you to the door of your hotel? You were faithful to your wife, but wasn't that because, in the town where you lived, there was no opportunity to cheat on her? You remembered the opportunities that you had been given for liaisons with women who crossed your path far from your home. You had never yielded. This evening, when this woman suggested going for a drink elsewhere, when you understood that her friends had discreetly left, you decided to go back to your hotel. She went with you. Having arrived at the threshold, neither of you spoke. You remained standing there without speaking, looking at one another. The moment she slowly approached, you told her you were going to bed. She smiled at you, and you left her after having gotten her contact information. In your room, you regretted nothing, and you fell asleep, in spite of feeling as though you passed the day simply killing the time that separated you from your return. The next day, you were awakened by this same impression of vacuity. You made the same gestures as the day before, getting up, opening curtains, shaving, and washing. You went down for breakfast in the dining room. It was empty. It was nearly 10 o'clock. You read a local newspaper from the day before, cursorily. Back upstairs in your room, you hardly remembered the news that you had just learned. You went back out and set off at random into the town, but your steps spontaneously led you to the same locations that you had strolled the day before. You paid less attention to what you were looking at. The places no longer had the attraction of novelty. You had decided to walk, taking the first street on the right, the second street on the left, the first street on the right, and so on, without deviating from this method, so as to not let yourself be guided by the appeal of whatever turned up. You passed the day in this way, looking on your map from time to time at where chance was leading you. You had lunch in the cafe on a square, in a working-class neighborhood nearly 5 kilometers from the city center. You watched the passers-by and you gathered statistics to keep yourself busy. You counted the number of women, men, and children. You classified people by age, by their probable jobs, and according to more subjective criteria, like the taste revealed by their clothing, or the strangeness of their gait. You stayed for 2 hours doing this on the terrace of the cafe. After having reread these statistics, you were struck by their absurdity. What meaning did this inventory have, for which no one had use, and with which you would do nothing? You tore up the pages and you threw them in the gutter. It was 3 o'clock. Rather than resuming your random walk, you returned by the shortest route to the city center. When you got to your hotel, it was still too early for dinner. You decided to take the same route as the day before, to verify if, what you had seen was now anchored in your memory. You didn't look at the map. You didn't hesitate once over changes in your direction. You didn't hesitate once over changes in direction. You noticed the same details: signs, sidewalk, roadwork. Only the passers-by broke the monotony of the spectacle. You felt your body tiring. This urban strolling was turning into an accidental gymnastic exercise. Having come back to your point of departure, you had lost any notion of time. You looked at your watch and were flabbergasted to discover that 4 hours had slipped by. You decided to dine in the first restaurant that offered itself to you. It was the Clos St. Vivien, a restaurant with traditional bourgeois cooking, elegantly decorated. You chose the first dishes from each section of the menu: a foie gras with mango preserves, a rib steak with bordelaise sauce and sautéed potatoes, and a raspberry cake. The hushed atmosphere reassured you, but the marked attention of the waiters watching you in order to respond to your wishes weighed on you increasingly as the other customers left the restaurant. Before the last couple could leave, you paid the bill and left the restaurant. It was 12:30. Back at your hotel, you took notes in the last 2 days. You described what you had seen, done, and thought. While you believed that you had only passed through a zone of emptiness, the writing of this text kept you up until 5 in the morning. When you reread it the next day on the train that was carrying you back home, you added numerous notes in the margin. And when your wife asked you what you had done, you spent the entire night telling her, with innumerable details. You had felt idle in the city through which you had paced only to kill time, but the emptiness that you believed to be comforted with was an illusion. You had filled those moments with sensations all the more powerful in that nothing, and no one had distracted you from them. You directed toward yourself a violence that you did not feel toward others. For them, you reserved all your patience and tolerance. You used to tick the wrong boxes on administrative forms to fabricate a new identity for yourself under your own name. Sometimes you would tick yes for "I am on maternity leave," write 3 for number of children, and write Australian for nationality. You thought beautiful music was sad, and that sad architecture was ugly. You didn't vary the registers of friendship. You were predictable and reassuring, like a large stone on the edge of a path. You recounted, with the hint of a smile, the flip-flopping of that cousin of yours who complained to an old friend of recurring back pain, and then, 15 minutes later at the same cocktail party, exclaimed to another that he hadn't felt so good in years. What logic underlies such behavior? Loss of self? Unconscious contradiction? Calculated lie? The phrase, "a long black song," resurfaced in your consciousness unexpectedly. Where had you heard it? No memory came back to you. The effacement of its origins accentuated its ghostly character. You marveled at the story of the Parisian entrepreneur whose obsessive hobby consisted in documenting his daily existence. He saved letters, invitation cards, train tickets, bus tickets, metro tickets, tickets for trips by plane or by boat, his contracts, hotel stationery, restaurant menus, tourist guides from countries visited, programs from plays, day planners, notebooks, photographs. A room in his house, lined with file cabinets, served as the receptacle for his archives, always being expanded. At the center, organized in a spiral, a chronologically oriented plan indicated Paris, France, or a broad continent, seas, months, days, and different colors. With a glance, the man could visualize his entire existence. He had made a collection of himself. In front of an object whose function you did not know, but which you knew you could understand if you made the effort, you sometimes preferred to remain at the stage of speculation and spectacle, as when you basked in front of a beautiful landscape. To see it from a distance was enough for you. You didn't need to walk through it. To catch sight of an island from a boat could be more pleasurable than ever setting foot on it. You undertook the project of designing your own tomb. You didn't want to leave the delicate choice of your most enduring residence to others. It would be made from shiny, flat, and unadorned black marble. In front of it, a stele would indicate your name, your birth date, but also that of your death at 85 years old. It would not be a family tomb. You would occupy it alone. The dates would be engraved during your lifetime. You imagine the reactions of those walking through the cemetery, seeing a date of death in anticipation, located several decades in the future. Many scenarios could follow. Before your death, its date, set in advance, would turn your grave into a joke, or else a troubling prediction. If you died before the planned date, you could be buried, and the indicated date could be replaced with that of your actual death, which, in giving the lie to the original inscription, would trivialize your grave. But you could also be buried without changing the inscription. Visitors, believing it to be a joke, would laugh in front of the tomb, which nonetheless would contain a corpse. The stele would carry this joke up to what would be your 85th year. After this date, those who walked by would no longer have any idea of your eccentricity. Who would imagine that the inscription was false, that the man in the tomb had not died on the date indicated? Or you would die in the forecasted year, at the age of 85, either naturally, which would be extraordinary since your death would be fulfilling your prediction, or by your committing suicide if you intended to keep the promise carved in marble. You could then be buried without the inscription on the stele being altered in the least. If you lived past 85, passers-by reading the dates would believe you to be dead, even though you would still be alive. And the day would come when you did die. If the stele was left unaltered, you would be buried in a grave whose inscription made you younger, unless you decided at the end the inscription should be updated to match the date of your death. Or you left the posthumous instructions for someone to perpetually push the inscribed date of your death further back, so that it would always be forecasted, but never achieved. Your suicide put an end to those complex hypotheses, but your wife, who knew of your project, had your tomb built according to the drawings that you left. She had the dates of your real birth and your death engraved on the black stele. 25 years separate them, not 85. It didn't occur to anyone but you to joke about your death. It was easy for you to meet new people face to face, as it was difficult to meet them in a group. One day, I had invited you to come to breakfast at my parents' family home a few kilometers from where you lived. We should have been alone, but toward the end of the morning, several friends surprised me by paying me a visit, and I suggested that they stay for the meal. When you appeared at the corner of the house, as we were having an aperitif in the sun, you discovered a table for 6 instead of 2. Your expression fell apart in a second. He recomposed himself when you saw that I had understood that you were upset. You didn't try to hide your feelings from me, but you wanted to avoid the impoliteness of seeming disagreeable to my friends. I knew that you could have preferred to turn on your heels and go home right away, rather than stay and converse with people you would never see again. They all knew each other well. You had a gift for perceiving in an instant how long or short-lived friendships were, from the amount of noise a conversation generated, from the liveliness of the voices, from the play of glances. You would have preferred to join a group of strangers getting to know each other rather than this tribe that had formed so far from you so long ago. But you made the effort to stay. You spoke all afternoon to the same woman, who you succeeded in keeping at arm's length, near the chestnut tree, then under the cedar. Your attraction was reciprocated, but you couldn't manage to dissociate her from the group in which you had discovered her. The shadow of the others hung over her. Looking at her, you worried you wouldn't be able to forget the imprint of her friends. You refused to be the odd one out. Even if this group welcomed you, you would remain the latecomer. To the already constituted friendships that one joins as a stranger, you preferred those that came together in your presence. The latter you saw being born and developing, and though you wouldn't predict which particular affections would weave themselves together, you knew it would happen at the same time. You would be all equal in facing the future. By the end of this day, you understood that the common past of my friends would always keep you at a distance. You preferred not approaching the circle to having to remain at its edge. You successfully passed the written examination, allowing your entrance into the Grande École. In the oral part of the admissions examination, the general culture test, you had half an hour to prepare a speech on the topic. Must one be afraid of having to live one's death? You felt dizzy before this paradoxical formulation. Can death be lived? Yes, the question implied, since it asked whether such should be feared. You were 20 years old. Up until then, you had thought of death as a phenomenon that occurred only to others, and which, when it happened to you, would carry you off without bringing your consciousness to it. To live death, was this to see it coming and to welcome it, rather than abruptly undergoing, without having the time to feel oneself departing? Was this to choose by anticipation in order to affirm one's free will before the ineluctable? These questions rattled in your mind, and, on your blank page, you took disordered notes, among them this one, which you cited to me later. Death is a country of which nothing is known. No one has returned to describe it. The question was too important for you to be able to take some distance from it. The half-hour flowed by without succeeding in putting your ideas in order. You had entered a hall where 2 examiners, seated behind a table, greeted you coldly. You took your place and began to enunciate the ideas you had noted down in the chaotic order they appeared. You believed you read disappointment in the examiners' faces. They remained silent while the words left your mouth mechanically, as if pronounced by someone else. You repeated aloud the meanderings of your thought. One of the 2 men took up one of your affirmations in a questioning tone. Death is to life what birth is to the absence of life. A long silence followed. You didn't respond, petrified, as if death were addressing you in person. It wasn't embodied in the examiners. It prowled about the room between them and you. You were now just waiting for the test to end. Passing this exam was no longer important. Though when leaving the room you were certain of failing it, you were not sorry to have taken the test. To have perceived death, and the incomprehension accompanying it, was more important to you than the results. Later, you were told that you had been accepted. Your speech about death had received one of the highest grades. You refused to enter the school. You would have liked to receive, along with the invitations, the menus of the dinners to which you had been invited, in order to delight in advance over the dishes you would consume. To future pleasure would have been added a sequence of present desires. You wanted to know your future, less to reassure yourself about what you would become, rather than to live through anticipation the life that awaited you. You used to dream of an exhaustive day planner when your days would be recorded up to your death. You'd be able to prepare yourself for the joys and trials of the next day as well as those of days far off. You would be able to consult the future like you would remember the past and circulate there at will. But one day this planner showed your life to you as a huge thorny wall. A life foreseen was reassuring to you because you imagined it to be made up of pleasures. In fact, nothing stipulated what the day planner would contain. It could have been your worst nightmare, or a sequence of scheduled hardships that you would have no choice but to prepare yourself to brave. Misrecognizing the future, however, could render it desirable. You used to want only to perform acts that would resonate for a long time, gestures that, though completed in a few minutes, would leave vestiges to persist and continue to be seen. Your interest in painting depended upon this suspension of time and matter. The brief time of its realization is succeeded by the long life of the painting. Summer, on the coast, used to sail a catamaran single-handedly. You tightened the ropes and sailed straight ahead. Why tack to the coast when the waves were the same all over? A straight line suited you. You weren't preoccupied with an itinerary. You steered the bow toward the horizon, back turned to the coast. You wanted to forget land, but your expeditions were too brief for you to be surrounded by nothing but sea. Air filled your lungs, waves drowned your hearing. The movement of the boat kept your body occupied as it sought balance. The rocking of the waters hypnotized you at the same time as the wind kept you alert. You liked this lucid somnolence, similar to that of a child rocked by a wet nurse singing the melody in a gentle voice that will put it to sleep. Then you would need to turn back. You would come about and try hard to return as directly as you had left, despite the direction of the wind, which compelled you to tack. The sight of the land far away brought you back to the reality the sea had made you forget. As you drew nearer to the beach, you would leave behind the waking dream the waves had thrown you into. One night, in a large town in Provence, you walked for 3 hours at night through the streets at random. You reached a neighborhood devoid of charm, marked by two large boulevards. Cheap-looking buildings alternated with housing projects, retirement homes, garages, grocery stores, ladies' hairdressers, and stores selling vacuum cleaners and pet products. A thick odor of frying and simmering meat escaped from a restaurant cloaked in dirty curtains, where a truck stop menu was on display. The orange urban lighting ruined the pleasure you would have been able to take in looking at the few villas from a previous century miraculously preserved between two concrete blocks. You came to a small church bordering on a cemetery. The white gravestones cut off by an entry gate adorned with a large cypress tree appeared to you as an oasis of calm beauty. You had never before thought to look in a cemetery alone at night. Guarding against it was your unconscious dread of ghosts. A hook in a stone of the wall and a support high up on the gate decided you. Without reflection, you started to scale the wall before thinking about how you would get back out. A car came by. You climbed back down to let it pass. Next came a motorcycle, then another car. While waiting, you pretended to be looking at the opening and closing hours of the cemetery on a small plaque. It was 2 a.m. You started climbing again, and in a few moments you were inside the outer wall. You didn't know whether the cemetery was guarded like the neighboring building sites. Your steps crunched on the gravel. You were not now afraid of ghosts. You had already been thinking about death so often for such a long time that they had become quite familiar to you. To see these graves in the penumbra reassured you as if you had come to a silent ball organized by benevolent fronds. You were the only outsider there, the living person surrounded by recumbent statues that love him. The apparition of a guard or a prowler would have disturbed you more than that of a specter. In this vista of stone softened by darkness, your thoughts floated about as though you were between life and death. You felt a stranger to yourself, but intimately acquainted with this place peopled with the dead. You had rarely experienced this feeling, to be already dead, but looking at the hills unfolding below the cemetery, where lights were shimmering through the windows of houses, you suddenly returned to the land of the living. A survival instinct then guided your steps toward the exit. Some supports allowed you to scale the wall to get out. While coming down on the roadside of the wall, your foot pushed against the cemetery gate, which opened. It wasn't locked. Access had been freely available. You had climbed over for nothing. Sun, heat, and light, which delighted those around you, appeared to you as perturbations of your solitude, summons to the outdoors, obligations to joy. You refused to have your euphoria put down to climate. You wanted to be solely responsible for it. If you were asked to do something on account of the good weather, you declined the invitation. Gray weather, winter, rain, or cold did not displease you. Nature then seemed to be in tune with your mood. If the weather was poor, you would be let off the hook. No one would think about reproaching you for not going out. You could stay at your place without the anomalous appearance of your shutting yourself in. No one would come around asking questions about your taste for staying indoors. You used to say that distinction, which is the opposite of discretion, was too visible a version of elegance. You wanted to be discreet. You were said to be elegant. You would have preferred to be neutral, but your beauty and your stature ensured you were noticed in a crowd. You considered wearing poorly tailored clothing, stooping, making clumsy gestures to efface yourself behind a less desirable facade. You were afraid that these artifices would themselves be noticed. It would make you seem affected, vain. You therefore resigned yourself to your natural elegance. In the metro in Paris, you entered a train car and sat down on a folding seat. 3 stations later, a homeless man came to sit next to you. Her sight, he turned toward you, sniffed several times, and said, it smells flowery in here. You'd put on a fragrance the morning before going out. For once, a homeless man made you laugh. Normally, such people made you uncomfortable. You didn't feel threatened. They'd never caused you any harm, but you were afraid of ending up like them. Nothing justified this fear, however. You were not alone, poor, alcoholic, abandoned. You had a family, a wife, friends, a house. You did not lack money, but homeless people were like ghosts foretelling one of your possible ends. You didn't identify with happy people, and in your excessiveness you projected onto those who had failed in everything, or succeeded in nothing. The homeless embodied the final stage in a decline in your life which could have tended toward. You did not take them for victims, but for authors of their own lives. As scandalous as it seems, you used to think that some homeless people had chosen to live that way. That was what disturbed you the most, that you could, one day, choose to fall. Not to let yourself go, which would have only been a form of passivity, but to want to descend, to degrade yourself, to become a ruin of yourself. Memories of other homeless people came to your mind. You couldn't prevent yourself, when you saw some, from stopping to watch them at a distance. They owned nothing, lived from day to day without domicile, without possessions, without friends. Their destitution fascinated you. You used to imagine living like them. Abandoning would have been given to you in what you had acquired. You would detach yourself from things, from people, and from time. You would situate yourself in a perpetual present. You would renounce organizing your future. You would let yourself be guided by the randomness of encounters and events, indifferent to one choice over another. When, seated in the metro, you were imagining to yourself what it would be like to live in his shoes, your neighbor stood up, staggering, and left to join a group of drunk homeless people on the next metro platform. One of them was slumped on the ground, asleep with his mouth open, belly up, one shoe undone. He resembled a corpse. This was perhaps what you feared, to become inert in a body that still breathes, drinks, and feeds itself, to commit suicide in slow motion. You had hung up a portrait of your great uncle in your study on the wall behind the desk, so that when you seated your back was turned to it. You used to say that this way was, to him, having him look like... You used to say that this way it was him who looked at you, not the other way around. His eyes were permanently fixed on you, and if you wanted to see him, you had to turn around. As such, when you looked at him, or received your frank, sustained attention, bearing no resemblance to the furtive glances you gave him on entering the room. In the town where you lived, there could be neither psychoanalysts nor psychiatrists. You wondered whether your malaise could be attributed to a physical malfunction. You made an appointment with a general practitioner who prescribed you antidepressants. You took them as an experiment. After a few days, you experienced a strange feeling. You heard words leave your mouth as if they belonged to someone else. Your gestures were brusque. You approached your wife, and suddenly took her in your arms. You embraced her violently, and then rapidly detached yourself. She watched you brush her aside without understanding why, her arms held out toward you. You next picked up a book and started reading. The words on the page sketched out the lines of an abstract painting. Their meaning escaped you. You put it back down. You went into the kitchen and made a sandwich that you didn't eat. You went into the street to take a stroll. And you came back a few minutes later because you didn't know why you had gone out. You smoked a cigarette that put you out after a few drags. You sat down at your work desk and reread the exchange rates before bringing out some bills that needed paying. Nothing kept your attention. You organized files. You thought of the long list of things you had to do without managing to discipline your mind. Agitation led you without logic from one action to another, so you accomplished none. At night, you were too on edge for sleep. The first few days, you had turned gray by the lack of sleep, as one might be after having stayed up all night. But 2 weeks later, your sleep reserves had been entirely exhausted. Your insomnia had a mind-numbing effect. You became stupid. Your memory grew weaker. You labored to remember proper names, including those of people you knew well. It took you 2 days to recall the name of a friend whom you hadn't seen for only a few months. Her face and her voice came to you without difficulty, but her name seemed never to have existed. You only found it by rereading your address book. You went back to the doctor's office. He prescribed you a new antidepressant, which also acted as a sleeping pill. Taking it, you immediately found yourself in a deep sleep, but unfortunately, you never really woke from it. During the day, you floated in somnolence. You spoke in slow motion. You articulated poorly. You responded to questions only after a delay. Your bearing became heavier. You dragged your heels. Outside, you walked abnormally straight. You avoided obstacles at the last possible moment. Sometimes you disregarded them entirely. You walked through a puddle with indifference. You bumped into a lamp post with your shoulder. Pedestrians turned around to look at you in the street. You lived in an immediate present. Your memory of recent events became thin. You didn't retain the stories just told you. In the middle of an anecdote you were being told, you asked somehow how it had begun.